Thanks for making it out this afternoon. I'm Sonia Shesna. I think you know most of you, but I'm a professor here in computer science. And for the last month or so, Professor Pam Briggs has been visiting us in our lab, and she's here until the end of June. So if you guys are interested in what she's doing, feel free to come visit or set up a time to come chat with her. She's happy to speak with anybody. But today she's going to give us a bit of a talk about some of her research. So she is a professor of applied psychology at Northumbria University in the UK. And she was one of the founding members of, and I'm going to get this wrong, UK's Research Institute in the Science of Cybersecurity. So this means that she looks at sort of the human factors part of cybersecurity. And I will leave it up to her to tell us a little bit more about her work.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to start by a bit of a plug for where I come from, because it is a beautiful city, and I work at Northumbria University. This is the design school in Northumbria, but one day a week I also work in Newcastle University, which is where the Open Lab is. And it's a really nice environment to do HCI work, but the two universities handle it very differently, and I think it's an interesting thing just to reflect on the model. At North Lab, that's a virtual gathering of 3 different departments. It's people who do HCI in design, computer science, and in psychology department, and each one of us has our own little group. So the equivalent of Chorus would be our Pact Lab, but Pact Lab works with the others across to make the bigger community like in the room today, I think. In Newcastle, Open Lab is one of the biggest HCI groups in the world, I would say. And actually, if we look at Kai's, oh no, this isn't my latest presentation. Never mind. If you look at, I'll wing it without those little changes. If you look at the Kai stats by city, Newcastle is 3rd ranked in terms of Kai papers, and the top 10 are all in the US. So it's really, you know, it's the first city outside the US for HCI research. So we had about, I think it was about 35, 37 Kai papers last year, and Newcastle probably contribute about 2/3 of that, and Northumbria 1/3, but there's quite a lot of authorship overlap as well. So for a community to do HCI research, it's a really nice environment. Now, I'm going to talk about my cybersecurity work, and I'm going to particularly talk about this idea of behavior change and using psychological theories and models. So I'm going to talk about the CHASE project work in the main, which was the work associated with this research institute in the science of cybersecurity. I would like to point out that I do 2 other kinds of work, really. I do a lot about trust in e-health, which I'm not going to talk about today. And I also do quite a lot of work on social identity and the way you manage your identity through social media, which of course you get some security privacy things going on there, but so there's a bit of overlap. But today I'm going to focus on cybersecurity. And the CHASE project is an interesting project. So a lot of it was about understanding the risk about bring your own device and the way in which people kind of create organizational cyber risks by using mobile phones or laptops that they take home from the office, etc., to do their work. And we in this group, the psychologists as part of the project, were responsible for pulling behavioral theories that we thought would be interesting to drive some of the work, and also behavioral economics theories, and quite often they get fudged together, but actually there's a huge history and tradition of 2 separate streams of thought. A psychology approach to behavior change, which often takes a very long-term approach, looks at dispositional factors in behavior change, attitudes and behaviors over a long period of time, maintaining new behaviors, and the behavioral economists who tend to look at nudge and little design or a choice architecture tweaks to make people behave in certain ways. But we've tried to combine both of those approaches into this one project. And so we had a series of studies that we looked into these effective behavioral influences, and we also did some stuff on personality dimensions as well, which there is now emerging a small literature on personality issues around cybersecurity as well. So I'm going to start with the approaches both from psychology and behavioral economics, because I think it's typical of the way a psychologist goes about doing HCI research that we are theory-led, and we start by saying what is there in the body of knowledge that tells us about how people behave, and how can we use that then to influence future behaviours. And in this space, I like protection motivation theory. There are over 80 theories of behaviour change, so there's plenty to choose from, as is quite typical again in psychology. But protection motivation theory is a really, I don't know, it's kind of self-explanatory. It makes a lot of sense, particularly for cybersecurity. So PMT talks about two different appraisals that people make in governing their behaviour. And PMT does not just apply to cybersecurity, it's really been developed around health behaviour change and the way in which you might change your behaviour according to health threats. But the first appraisal you make is a threat appraisal. And you make that threat appraisal in two parts. You decide on the perceived severity of a threatening event. So to take a health example initially, if there's a pandemic, then the severity is high. You know, it's a major threatening event. In cybersecurity, WannaCry, a major cybersecurity event. So the severity is high. But then you look at your vulnerability to that event, which is the perceived probability that it will affect you and your own organisation or you personally. So that's more to do with your own vulnerability, not simply the severity. So you've got those two appraisals that you make around the threat itself. And then, sort of balancing that, you decide on whether or not you can respond. I've put there a response appraisal, sometimes called a coping appraisal, which is, can we make an effective response, and how costly is it to make that effective response? So the can we make an effective response will be to do with our knowledge of how to act. Do we have the resources available? I mean, in a health domain, we might know that we should get a vaccination, but we might not, you know, the vaccination supplies might have dried up, or we might not know who to turn to get it. Typically in health, you know who to go to. In cybersecurity, you often don't know who to go to get advice about that. So can we make an effective response? And then, do you believe that the response is going to be effective? If, for instance, you strengthen your password, do you believe that's going to make a difference in protecting you? And also the cost of making a response. If you've got a really strong password, but of course the cost is the memorability is so poor. You know, if you're changing them all the time, it's a productive security cost. You know, it takes you a long time to get your head in the game. So those two appraisals are what underpin protection motivation theory. So that kind of accounts for the beliefs and attitudes that might drive behaviour. But how can you nudge behaviour? Well, the kind of approach we liked is mind space. It's a very UK-centric approach. So I don't know if over here you ever heard about what was called the nudge unit in the British government. So there was a group of people set up to try and affect also, you know, try and get people to adopt all sorts of things like taking up certain policies, like not driving beyond speed limits, etc. And this nudge unit would inform government policy. The people working there, some of the people working there developed this mind space, and mind space is just an acronym for the different ways you can nudge behaviour. So there are messenger effects. We're influenced by who communicates a message. There are incentives, so you can reward certain behaviours over others. Norms, social norms, we tend to behave the way our peers behave, and there are strong norm expectations there. Defaults, very typical kind of understanding in the HCI community. The way you set up the default tends to drive behaviour. Salience, our attention is drawn to something that seems novel or particularly relevant to us, so you can make certain aspects of cue in certain things. You get priming effects, so if you want people to behave in certain ways, you can sort of lay down a prime a bit earlier to trigger those behaviours. Affect, our emotional associations shape how we behave. commitments, if we make a public promise, this is very widely used in the health behavior change literature. If I make a public promise to you that I'm not going to eat any chocolate for the rest of the week, I'm much more likely to not eat chocolate than if I just make the promise silently to myself. And ego, we often act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. So we tried to pull together this PMT and mind space, the psychological and the behavioral economics ways of thinking. So here you see the threat appraisal, severity, vulnerability, the response costs in terms of things like the organizational support, work demands, the response efficacy, your belief that you can do something and it's going to be effective. We pulled those together with some of the different kinds of ways that you can nudge. So for instance, let's go left to right. So the severity of the threat, well, can we make the ongoing threat more salient? Can we use social norms about what people, how many people believe they're going to be affected by the threat? Can we tweak those? Affect users worry about the threat. Can we use ego messages about making people feel more personally responsible, or commitment messages? Messenger effects. Do bosses prioritize cybersecurity? Where are you getting your cybersecurity messages from in an organization? Are the defaults easy? The usability good? And response efficacy. Here, what are the norms about how you cope and make a response? Are there social norms in an organization? I don't know if any of you have been reading the shadow security work recently coming out of UCL. About shadow security, where people develop social norms. We're interested in that. And then this ego affect thing, are users empowered to act? So this is the kind of combining of psychological theory and of behavioral economics. So I'm now going to move on to talking about our studies, but just so that you've sort of pulled that together, we've got PMT that recognises both that threat and coping appraisals are important. We've got Mindspace that gives us an armory of a range of behavioural nudges that you could apply. And then we've mapped the two to sort of think about how we might drive interventions. So, okay. Right. I wondered where my figure had gone. It is annoying when you've loaded at the wrong slide. This is the one other slide that I'd made some changes to. But anyway, what we can do with incident reporting is I'd map them more carefully to make it obvious from what I was just saying. But you can look at the kind of space around incident reporting, which is our first study, and you can understand that there's issues to do with your altruism, your perceived responsibility. There's some social effects to do with social loafing, which is a well-known psychological thing where you think, oh, somebody else is going to take responsibility for it or report an incident. I don't need to. We don't all need to act. There's issues to do with understanding about, if I make a report, if there's a problem or an incident happened, if I report it, who does the report go to? And that ties up with some messenger effects about who sends you the message. So when you get a little notification pops up in your screen, say there's a problem here, what's the mental model about who sent me that message? Who's responsible for this? It's a very fuzzy part of cybersecurity. And so you've got all this going on. And in terms of the literature around incident reporting, so we've got examples here from the literature. Security threats generally, we know, are poorly understood. Individuals also avoid overloading themselves with information. So they get too many notifications and messages and they tend to just switch off. Security advice often rejected, often because it's too difficult to make a response and you're not quite sure what response to make. And then, some of the error reporting requests share characteristics with other prompts, some of which seem a little bit troublesome in their own right. So there's a whole thing, raft of reasons why we don't always report a problem. So we conducted a study where, of course, my phone always switches itself off when I'm keeping an eye on how I'm doing for time. We conducted a study where we had a kind of sham user task which was to evaluate some websites, travel websites. And while they were trying to look at these booking sites, we're asking them to say, would you trust this company, this booking site, and would you book your holiday through them? We would have a problem message appear, a notification appear, and what we were interested in knowing is how we could nudge people around taking some responsibility for that notification and actually notifying, forwarding the message that, oh yeah, we've got a problem, and reporting the problem. And we had a 2x3 factorial design. So the first factor we manipulated was whether or not the problem was framed as a technical issue or a cybersecurity issue. And the reason we did that is this business about where the message is coming from and who's responsible, and what your model of how to respond is all about. Because technical issues typically belong within the organization. The IT crew will put them right. Cybersecurity issues, people are just never sure who's responsible for cybersecurity in an organization. So we framed that differently. And then we were interested in this social loafing effect about taking responsibility and who benefits. And so we said that problem reporting will help us identify the source of the problem and protect you, or sometimes that's benefit to self, or sometimes we talked about benefits to others. So the design was really this kind of, we noted a problem on this page, technical versus security. A problem may indicate a technical issue versus a security issue, and then benefit self versus other. No benefit message as a control, and then the problem will protect you, help protect you, or the problem will help protect others in this organization. So that was the experimental design of this study. And what we found most, I suppose, significantly, or the major issue was this technical versus security. People were likely to report a technical problem, or much more likely to report a technical problem than they were to report a security problem. So a simple reframing of a message as a technical versus a security problem meant that people were likely to send the message forward. And as I said, that's in large part, we had some open-ended qualitative stuff going on where people explained why they felt they would report it. And when we look at that, it's very much about, well, I think, somebody within the organization would report it. I think there's more likely to be that feedback. They'll acknowledge they've had the report or whatever. I'll get something back. There'll be a closed loop. There'll be some learning going on. Whereas cybersecurity, it's just like, oh, I don't know, you send it into the ether. You don't know whether it's going to be effective. So as a coping appraisal, it's really, the efficacy is just not there for cybersecurity. And also the benefit to self statement helped support the belief that the cost of reporting was worthwhile. So compared to just a notification that didn't, all we're doing here is adding the message, this would benefit you. Compared to that, you can see the benefit to self in inducing reporting behavior is quite extreme. So there we're getting that classic effect of small nudges making quite a sizable difference. So that was the cybersecurity study. As I said, we had that little bit of qualitative analysis where threw up some interesting things. So the potential costs associated with incident reporting. So this is part of that whole productive security literature, which says actually security is not your primary task. You want to get on with the task at hand. It's unusable, so it slows you down, all of that kind of thing. We were getting quotes that fit that. The perceived efficacy, as I said, well, you report incidents in the past, nothing happened. You never get any message back saying thank you even. So it's just, And then the understanding of the threat, and this is, I think, quite a problem for cybersecurity. Quite a number of people said, well, I didn't want to click on the message to report it because I thought that might be a kind of phishing message in itself, and that's a threat in itself. And we are entering a world where a lot of low-level anxiety about cybersecurity, and people are never quite sure what the right thing to do is. So a second example, more about privacy than it is about security. We ran a cookie study, but it follows nicely because we use a very similar paradigm in this one, where we had a similar sham retail task, and this time we used social norms to make the threat either feel more personal, introduce that sense of vulnerability, but also as a social referent to correct responding. So here, are you going to accept cookies? I mean, this was coming out just around changes in EU cookie legislation. So this is about 3 years old now, this study. And it was an MTurk study, and we would say 74% of MTurkers like yourself have used this option versus 37% of MTurkers like yourself have used this option. So all you're giving is a social referent about how typical it is for people to respond against a very small wording nudge, but that again produces those kind of effects where if you look at acceptance or rejection of cookies, you can see the red yes bars, that in the 74% condition, you're getting far more people accepting cookies than in the 37% condition. The control actually tends to be accept. So the control with no social referent tends to also be quite high acceptance, which follows on with what you get in the rest of the literature. This one is the one that changes behaviour away from what the social norm, the existing norm is, to say only 37% do, and then you get a dip in people who say accept. So again, we're very simple little changes. But now we're going to look at some of the other things we bring into the studies, I suppose, as psychologists. And for this cookie study, one of the things we were interested in looking at was impulsivity. I've got some references in a minute to just two psychometric measures that I think are interesting in cybersecurity. I have seen papers on a third measure, which is agreeableness, which seems to be playing out. It's one of the big five, so any psychologist in the room know big five personality measures. But aside from the big five, where agreeableness often comes out, we've found impulsivity and also risk-taking, the scale. But if we look at impulsivity in terms of this social framing condition, we're finding differences that those with high impulsivity tend to show less of an effect of the manipulation, and that's because we believe they're not really reading the message. It's just like, get on to the next, yes, I'll accept cookies, move on to the next. So this kind of impulsivity factor tends to play in this space as well. Okay. And these are the two psychometrics. I know you won't be able to read this, but so we've used the Dickman, especially the dysfunctional impulsivity scale. Dickman has two impulsivity scales. One is about being functionally impulsive. It makes sense to be impulsive. I need to get on to the next task. Another is the dysfunctional impulsivity, where you just can't, you're very impatient and you can't really hang about. And dysfunctional impulsivity is quite interesting in cybersecurity. The other is the Dospot scale, which is domain-specific risk-taking scale that we use quite a lot, which is simply propensity to take risks. Right. So moving on to a different paradigm then. We were also interested in manipulations and little nudges that would influence fish detection. So we ran a study where we're trying to think about what manipulations we might use. And we're very interested in these social effects, because I think, we get a lot of our behaviours from social effects, the behaviours of those around us. And we decided to look at two kinds of manipulations. The first is when you receive an email, what is the sender salience? So if you look, we make the sender more salient, in this. So what we do here is highlight the name and the time of day the email is sent. So instead of just this all being part of a visual display as part of your email inbox, and you're not paying much attention, we're simply highlighting that. But also, time of day means that you're starting to tune in to when you'd expect those people to send you emails. You don't expect most people to send you emails at 3 in the morning. Emails that come in at 3 in the morning, more likely to be something that you don't necessarily want to respond to. So sender salience was done by highlighting the names and times. Then we also highlighted in another manipulation receiver salience, which is that an email that's fished to you and it looks like it's a special offer to you, we would say you and 351 other people in your organization have received this email. So we'd put something about the receiver salience of the message in as well. And the reason I've decided to show this is not so much because of the study and the manipulations, but more because we use signal detection theory, and I don't know how many people are familiar with signal detection theory, but I think for phishing studies, it's the smart way to go. And we also used confidence measures and calibration measures. So signal detection theory really takes that, signal detection theory developed from psychology during the war periods, information psychology, where people are looking at radar screens and you have to detect a target against a background of noise. So you're interested not only in the hits and the misses, but you're also interested in the false alarms. So signal detection theory is a relationship between, you take the Z-score of hits and the Z-score of false alarms as a measure of how sensitive you are to detection, but also uses a measure, various measures, but traditionally beta, which is a measure of bias. Do you tend to say, yes, there was a target there, or do you tend to say, no, there was a target? Bias has nothing to do with your sensitivity. It's simply your propensity to respond one way or the other. Anyway, overall what we found with the phishing study is that using D prime as a measure of sensitivity was that the sender salience, changing who the sender is, highlighting who the sender is, time the phish message arrived, had an effect. But I think the thing I like about this study is really what we did with the calibration curves. Remember, I've said one of the things in cybersecurity is that people feel overwhelmed and they're not very confident in knowing how to cope. Their coping strategy, their decision making, they feel like they're guessing a lot of the time, so people have a lot of low-level anxiety in this space. And what you can do in studies like this is to ask people to rate as a percentage their confidence in the decisions that they make. But then you can do a calibration of the confidence measures that they give with their actual performance. And obviously, if they were 80% confident and got 80% right on the phish, that would be perfect calibration. So anything on the diagonal is perfect calibration. Calibration studies have been done for years, and my favorite piece of that literature is that weather forecasters are perfectly calibrated, right? On 20% of the days they say it's going to rain, on 20% of the days they say the chance of rain is when they say the chance of rain is 20%, then it will rain on 20% of those days. Doctors are absolutely awfully calibrated because they never get decent feedback. They say, oh yeah, I think you've got this, take these pills. People go away and they never come back and say whether it worked or not. So doctor calibration is awful. But anyway, so the interesting thing I think is that first of all, if we look at the genuine emails, you can say genuine emails are better calibrated than the phishing emails, but you get major underconfidence. So anything above that line is underconfidence. People are generally underconfident. The calibration not too bad for genuine. For phishing emails, just nothing. They just don't know what's going on. So that whole thing about having a sense that you know as a user what you're doing when you try and control cybersecurity it's a bit of a mess. And so my last study, which is going to be presented at SOUP, so it's, am I allowed to? Well, I'm doing it now. So, James is going to present this last study, is this new way of thinking about the organizational position in terms of that idea about calibration. So I'm picking up on some of these social influences and calibration. How well do people, personally calibrate their own understanding of cybersecurity with what an expert might think? And how well do groups calibrate their perceptions of cybersecurity with what an expert group of cybersecurity professionals, CISOs, might think? So we've developed this cyber survival task based on a set of tasks that's already out there in the literature, two types of tasks. One's called the desert survival task and another's called the moon landing task. Has anyone done either of those? They're often used for management tasks to look at group communication. Simply put, the task asks you, I'll start with the desert survival task, because that's, you land in a desert, here are a list of 20 things. Could include a bottle of water, a penknife, you know, a whole load of 20 things. You've got to rank order them in terms of what will be most useful for you in the desert. Meanwhile, a group of experts, desert survival experts, have ranked that list behind the scenes. So first of all, you get people to rank as individuals. Say, oh yeah, this is my ranking. Then you get them to talk about it in a group. And the reason the desert survival task is used for management, consultancies, etc., is what goes on between that individual ranking and the group decision making is really interesting. Who dominates, how opinions shift within the group, etc. So we've done this as a cyber security task. So you've got 20 things like use strong passwords, always log out, you know, things that come from the literature, but that were then checked with our organizational CISO, and this was piloted in one university, then done in another university, so a university cyber security officer. 20 items, the experts have ranked them in their own little world, and then we get a group of academics to rank them, a group of support staff to rank them, and they rank them individually, and then they share their individual rankings and find out top and bottom, what their top 5, bottom 5 were. They then, then they do a group ranking and work out top 5 and bottom 5 and start to discuss them within the group. And we're interested in all sorts of things. We're interested in how different the group rankings are from expert rankings, and why, because we then get to talk about why they've ranked them. We're also interested in those social norms, social group effects, about what happens when they've ranked individually and they start to talk to the rest of the group about them. And we're interested in what the CISOs think about that and how that process could be used to help them reflect about what's going on in their own organization. So this was the set of 20 behaviors that we used in our ranking. So they're the kind of things that people are now familiar with from cybersecurity. Don't click on links from unknown people. Don't write down passwords. Clear browser cookies. Be suspicious of links. Fake. Install OS updates. All, you know, a lot of different things. So those were the list. And then, rather like with that calibration curve, what you can do is plot expert rankings against your own either individually rankings, but from the group, either taking the mean of individuals within the group or then showing the group rankings. So this is the plot you get. We've got the expert rankings on the bottom, and then we've got the support staff in this case, not the academic staff, but the administrative staff in the university going up on the y-axis. And of course, perfect rankings would be on the diagonal. So there's a number of things that you can get from this. One is to say, all right, the two quadrants that more or less align with the diagonal, that's, you know, people are pretty much agreeing with the experts. The two quadrants on the opposite corners here, that's where stuff's going on that shouldn't be going on. The experts are saying this is really important, and the users are going, oh no, we don't think that's very important. So, for instance, one of the things, bizarrely, the users are going, don't click on any links from emails, and the experts are going, oh, the experts are saying, oh, that's not that important, we're not that bothered. So we asked the experts, why are you not that bothered about that when the users are really getting the message and starting to say, no, I mustn't click on it? And they go, well, mostly we've got software that takes care of that. So there's that kind of interesting attitude there. On the other hand, you know, you've got right, the experts. Number one, the experts say, ask for advice. We want people not to just make their own rules up as they go along, but ask for advice. And of course, the staff are going, who's got the time to ask for advice? You know, we'll ask. And when they do say they're going to ask for advice, they say, well, I'll ask, you know, Betty at the next table to tell me what I should be doing. I'm not going to phone an expert and ask for advice. So you're getting that kind of clash of views there. The other thing that we've got in this diagram is the little dotted arrows. And those arrows show what happened between an individual ranking and then we get people to discuss as a group. And actually what you're finding with this group here is that people tend to migrate more, and we can measure that, you know, as whether or not it's a significant shift. But people tend to migrate away from the agreed rankings. So actually, even if you then look at individual rankings, and they're not that different from the experts, by the time they've discussed it in their group, in their social shadow security group, they've moved further away from the experts, because they've all decided amongst themselves, oh yeah, you're right, you know, we don't need to do that, that's not our responsibility, and why should we worry about that, or that's not important. So I think that trying to tackle that social dynamic in an organization around how cyber security knowledge and reasoning gets socially constructed, I think is interesting. So that was my last study. That's a bit of a kind of flag about the way the CISOs in this organization loved it. So these are they really, when we went back to them then and we said, right, these are the transcripts, this is what people have said, this is the ratings they've got, this is why they rated it. The cybersecurity experts really said it gave them a lot of food for thought. I'll let you just read these. So I think as a visualization about how far in an organization the cybersecurity experts who are making the organizational policies, and there's a whole literature about whether policies themselves are usable or unusable, but they make the policies. It's quite a nice way of repurposing that, packaging it back to getting them to think about the fact that their users are a little bit distant from where their thinking is. The reviewers of this paper, rightly so, I think, said, well, it's a very onerous task. So, couldn't you do it online and stuff? And you could, but I do think you learn a lot from that group discussion around why people have ranked things the same there. So if you were a consultancy going into organisation trying to work out what's going wrong, I think the full task with all the group discussion is useful. If you want a quick and dirty snapshot of, are we a bit off track here, is the policy not getting through, then I guess you could automate certain elements of the task. Okay, so what I've tried to say so far then in those studies and in the introduction is we can change behaviours using that protection motivation theory. You can induce greater theories of feelings of vulnerability if you combine it with this coping strategy, a sense of actions that will produce benefits. In the literature as a whole on threat appraisals and fear appeals, which is generally loads big campaigns that make people fearful, there's a real trend now in the literature to show that fear appeals on their own will backfire unless you're also helping people know how to cope with them, because fear appeals will make people anxious, but unless you're providing a mechanism to allay that anxiety, like, oh, now I know what to do, what you get is defensive responding. So just, you will die unless you, learn to climb huge mountains. People just go, I can't listen to that. I've got to, I'm not able to even listen to the message because I'm not able to climb mountains. So you've got to get a balance. Fear appeals really work well if you've got like the coping appeals alongside them. Some personality factors important, and then I really think this social thing is becoming bigger in cybersecurity, that whole social dynamic. And bearing in mind that organisational work groups develop their own norms, this shadow security idea within an organisation is important. So some of the behaviour change stuff, Lynn Coventry and I put in a government paper using behavioural insights to improve the public's use of cybersecurity best practices. So if you just wanted an overview of some of the behavioural theories that get applied to cybersecurity, I've put that on the slide in case people want to circle the slide. And then these are not my papers, but these are just some other things that papers that have used protection motivation theory in cybersecurity, and another example of personality and cybersecurity to give you a bit of a feel for it. And that's everything I have. Thank you very much.
there's lots of time for questions if anyone has anything they want more details on.
Or we could go home with.
You've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
So I catch up in my head. I think the over and under confidence work in the signal detection I love because it's like physics and
Right.
all that stuff. Thank you. One of the things that happens when we are evaluating a threat that comes in on our emails or something like that is that we may feel threatened, or we might think we're not certain, so we don't click on that link. But we never hear back, so we're not allowed to calibrate. We don't have the tools to calibrate, other than the fact that hey, the last 2 months my computer has still been working.
Yeah.
And that's not good enough. So, is there any worth or any strength in somehow having an organization within your organization that somehow gives us updates on what has happened, if people open this email, 500 people lost their operating system or whatever. Would that help? Or does it really matter?
I think the feedback loop is really important, and you're right. It's so, because I've worked in health and cybersecurity, I'm often comparing where we are with both. And health is so much more straightforward. For a start, so messenger effects, where the experts are, what to listen to in health and what not to. You might get the social effects as well, but if you decide you want expertise, you know who to go to. Who do you turn to in cybersecurity? It's very hard to know. And then the feedback thing with health is that, there's all sorts of monitoring you can do now, your Fitbit and all of that kind of thing, which tells you whether or not you're on the right track. And you've got nothing, you're always working like, oh, I've got a stronger password. Has that made a difference? I didn't click on that email. Has that made a difference? And particularly now, the false positives. So, you might, or the missed opportunities. So you might decide not to click on an email or open an attachment. And you worry that you've missed something completely. So I think there are now some organisations starting to work on that. And there's a company I've been working with in London called Think Cyber, and they are trying to develop more innovative methods of training that start to think about feedback loops and things like that, rather than you attend a training session, you go away, it was really boring and all. So they start to have regular. I think they probably do, they'll throw fish at you, but then they'll give you some feedback about whether you were choosing right or not. They'll do other little bits of gathering data that show you your own personal data and where you may be exposed. So they're trying to tailor the learning around cybersecurity a bit more to give you that feedback. And I think that could be quite powerful, actually, but it's not easy to do.
No, of course.
Yeah. Funnily enough, that company, so it was originally the two guys who set it up, they were involved in cybersecurity in a big British company, and then they'd had enough, but they decided to set up on their own as a little SME, and they're doing really well with that training. So.
Well, awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Because remember, she would. So.
Well, I was trying to.
Oh, you can go ahead. Go ahead. I'm going to ask about data.
Is there a lot of information about different groups of people who may or may not have good cybersecurity habits? I was wondering, women versus men, older versus younger, that kind of thing. Are there individual differences in how good people are at managing their cybersecurity?
Yeah. So I think that we do a lot of age-related stuff. And we've got a big project on age-related stuff now. So I'll start with that because there is some interesting stuff. So the age-related stuff always used to be about the kids. They're terrible. They give too much away. They don't protect themselves. And if you look at things like the Dospert scale, risk propensity, then you tend to find young people take risks. And the older you get, the less inclined you are to take risks. So that's well established. But actually now, a lot of the cybersecurity stuff is that older people are becoming targeted, and younger people are getting more savvy. So, they're getting the right kind of education, the knowledge of how to protect themselves a bit better. So some big reports recently have said, actually, younger people are doing quite well in the way they protect themselves, but older people are pretty vulnerable because they don't, I don't know, they've got, they're either worried about everything, so they don't tend to use any kind of social media or any, any online banking stuff. Oh, sorry. Or they do go online, but then allow other people to sort of manage. A lot of them allow other people to manage what they're doing online. So they become less risk-taking, but on that basis of their mental models and stuff about what's going on, older people can be a bit more vulnerable. We did a huge study, behavioural economic study, with about, it came back from IGHCS with we're kind of rewriting it at the moment to go back into the pot. But we had about 7,000 participants in different countries to try and get some big demographic stuff. We got major country by country differences, like Spanish people don't care about their cybersecurity. But we got tiny gender effects, nothing really that you would worry about. Some age effects coming through there. Oh, sorry.
For just like kind of bouncing off this point, you're saying that the older age group is more vulnerable, and when you were talking about threat appraisal, there was 2 points. It's either the severity or the probability of occurrence.
Yeah.
And you kind of know which one they feel is less threatening to them, because if they feel that it's not severe, then maybe they would be more likely to click it. But if they feel that, oh, maybe this kind of thing happens all the time, so the occurrence is fairly high, then maybe they, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, which part of that.
Yeah, so there's different things play into both. So if you get something, so the WannaCry problem really was a big issue in the UK. The hospitals, a lot of the NHS struggled a lot with it, the National Health Service, and appointments were missed, and there was, everybody was really worried about what's going on. So that would affect things like the severity. So I think when it's big and public in the news, everybody's kind of hears about it. Where you get that sense of personal vulnerability is when people exchange stories. So where people are talking about, oh yeah, my neighbour had that problem, or and particularly I think phone scams with older people. So they start to hear that somebody's lost a lot of money within their social circle, and they really start to get worried about what they're doing and how they can protect themselves. But if they don't have the knowledge, then one of the things we're looking at the moment with older adults is their social network. So we're doing some social network mapping, and if people are very isolated and they don't have people they could turn to, how do they protect themselves, and where they're getting their knowledge from and stuff. So I think that vulnerability is affected by the sort of social knowledge that comes to you.
I've noticed that when you're creating passwords, you're getting a lot pickier about what you have to have in your passwords. Right? So you've got capital letters, you can only have one of these kinds of things, and so on and so forth. Is that based on research? Like, is that a kind of nudging as well? Is it based on research that says people will have terrible passwords unless you tell them what to do? If we tell them to read these things, the passwords get more secure. Or is it just better passwords?
So the original advice, I think, was very poor, because it came from security experts who were just saying, if we make it really different, they would do dictionary attacks and go, oh, these are easily cracked, these are not. So they would just push the idea of things that would not that would survive a dictionary attack. So things that didn't look word-like at all. And then, and also this changing passwords frequently. So the human side came in late, going, hang on a minute, people can't remember that many passwords, and it's a real problem. So I've got a little film with some of my participants, older adults, saying, well, I like a simple way. I keep the same password for everything. I never change it. It's that kind of, that's my reaction to that. But that Risks Institute that I'm involved in worked with GCHQ in the UK, and we helped develop that new password guidance that's been rolled out. NIST's got it as well, the 3 random words. So the latest guidance, right, is 3 random words. So use a password with 3 words that don't belong together, but that you can make memorable. You could create like a visual for them. Yeah, they're not random, but if you try and make them, you can. It's not bad. And also you can then start to have an association with 3 random words with the particular site, so they become site specific. So that is the latest guidance. However, this is typical in the cybersecurity world. You get guidance, and then you're on a website, and it's got a password system with a rating scale, with a feedback that won't let you choose 3 random words, because you have to have uppercase and lowercase. You have to have a special character and all that. So it's like nobody moves together, and you're left with this legacy of a mishmash of different systems where, government's giving you one advice, one kind of type of advice, and then the actual company's not, And then the whole thing about people requiring passwords for everything anyway, when, quite often all you wanted to do was visit a shop and see if they had something in store, and why you needed to create a password. Yeah, so they've ruined it, really.
So I know you're talking at a very high level with your studies, not going through all the details and things, but just for a pedagogical purpose, I'm just curious, in your first 2 studies, say, how many people are you running in those studies? Because I can't get a real sense without the data, without knowing, conference and goals and stuff. You're talking 30, 40, 50 people in these studies, or hundreds? So
obviously it depends on the cell size, but usually, so I think around, it would typically be around 25 per cell. We usually do a power analysis to work before we start. Okay. We're not always great on reporting on effect sizes, I have to say. It depends on my postdocs. If truth be told.
Sorry, I got a little confused about the perspective when you mentioned the younger generation and the senior ones. So are we trying to come up with some nudges that would help younger generations to have more secure cyber lifestyle, or are we kind of looking for a one-size-fits-all for everybody's using cyber security space? And as you mentioned about cookies, probably people in this room have different understanding from a message that says, hey, this website uses cookies as non-exact. So are we trying to come up with a nudge that is basically one-size-fits-all, or a specific group?
So I do think that, so part of the age work we're doing now is trying to work out to what extent does age make a difference if you were trying to communicate. So we are doing quite a big language piece around age at the moment. And actually what we're finding is that once you get into a working adult age doesn't make that much difference to the way you might phrase a message. People tend to use the same language. Younger people have a whole different understanding of security, and it's partly coming from the fact that everything in school is about cyberbullying. So their models are all based on cyberbullying models, which is the most important thing you get into the heads of young people. But it's not then till their working age that they start to think, oh, I've got finance resources to protect, or I've got other things to protect. And you then start to get into that other model of how you want to think about cybersecurity. So when we asked young people, for instance, to give us words that they associated with cybersecurity, it was all the bullying kind of stuff and protecting themselves using that language. So I think so what we concluded from that is that we really need to have a piece of work that prepares people for migrating from those young risks into older risks and doing a bit more proprietary work at that age, because it strikes me that that's never been made obvious, that somehow people then need to make the transition between thinking about one set of risks to thinking about another set of risks. For the others, I think you can often have a one-size-fits-all. I suppose one of the things, does that work in romance scams? probably for all adults it does as well, yeah. Just making people, yeah. I think that it's the young ones that are different.
One more question and then we'll
Yeah.
stop.
Just out of curiosity, in your own work on this behavioral change for security, what are some of the challenges you often are doing research? One of those.
Do you mean the methodology challenges rather than, yeah. The big one, and I've not solved this, and I think some places have it. I think Carnegie Mellon have it. But the big one to me is that difference between, it's ecological validity. It's constructing a study and trying to measure behavior. I mean, I like to measure attitudes, but I like to measure both attitudes and actual behavior. But to what extent is the behavior done and reported in the study representative of the behavior elsewhere? So for a long time, I've been talking to people, and we still haven't got it done yet, about getting people signed up to say they will be participants for a year, but never know, a bit like what people do in companies, you know, where you get a consultancy or the company will do phishing tests with them and, you know, penetration tests of various different kinds. But I would like to have a cohort of participants who we say, look, you've agreed to participate. That means we can, you know, send you little dummy attacks at any point and actually measure behavior, but you will know, you know, we'll tell you after the event and stuff like that. Sorry?
Sounds like Facebook.
Yeah, oh, A/B testing, yeah, Facebook. I want to be Facebook. As well, no, I don't want to be Facebook. But yeah, something like that, where you get studies at scale, but that are genuine behavioral studies. Because I'm still working in the construct a study, make it as real as possible. I mean, at the moment, I'm working with behavioral economists, and they do something really different to psychologists. So they play these games with money. So money becomes a kind of proxy. So, in fact, I was Skyping this morning with a guy we're working with, and he's going, all right, so, you know, you give everybody an endowment, and then they pay. And I'm going, but really, does that behavior, and they go, well, you know, the behavioral economists have shown that it does. And I'm going, oh. So I think that, you know, the validity there, the ecological validity is the big thing.